London, October 1944. At the Broadway Buildings, the gray, unremarkable structure in Westminster that served as the headquarters of MI6, a 32-year-old man settled into a new office on the upper floors. His name was Harold Adrian Russell Philby. His colleagues called him Kim, a nickname that had followed him since childhood, borrowed from the Kipling hero who moved unseen between two worlds. On this particular October afternoon, he had just been appointed head of Section 9, the division of British intelligence responsible for all operations against the Soviet Union. It was, by any measure, one of the most powerful positions in Western intelligence. The man now sitting at that desk controlled the entire anti-Soviet apparatus of MI6. He would receive every report, every agent's name, every operational plan directed against Moscow. He would liaise with the American OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, and coordinate the Anglo-American counterintelligence strategy against the Soviet Empire. Whatever the West planned to do against the Soviets in the coming years, Kim Philby would know about it first. That evening, according to the reconstruction assembled by intelligence historians, he sat down to write his first summary from the new office. He did not send it to the MI6 director. He did not send it to the Foreign Office. He sent it to Moscow. The question is not whether this happened. The documents confirm it did. The question is how a man could spend 30 years inside the most sensitive corridors of British intelligence and never once be stopped. The answer begins not in that Broadway office in 1944, but in a Cambridge common room a decade earlier, on a quiet autumn afternoon in 1934. The Cambridge 5 case presents an institutional paradox that intelligence services have been studying ever since, and still have not fully resolved. These were not desperate men. They were not ideological mercenaries, not blackmailed, not coerced, and crucially, not poor. Kim Philby was the son of Harry St. John Philby, one of the most celebrated Arabists and explorers in the British Empire, a man who had dined with Ibn Saud and advised the Colonial Office. Donald Maclean, codenamed Homer, was the son of Sir Donald Maclean, a former president of the Board of Education and cabinet minister. Guy Burgess, codenamed Hicks, came from a well-connected naval family. Anthony Blunt, codenamed Johnson, held a fellowship at Trinity College, Cambridge, and had a distant family connection to the British royal household. John Cairncross, codenamed List, was a scholarship boy from Scotland, the closest any of them came to working-class origins, and had achieved the highest marks of his year in the Foreign Office entrance examinations. They were, in the language of their era, exactly the right kind of people. And that is the impossibility, because it was precisely their being the right kind of people that made them invisible to a system that had never built any mechanism for doubting the right kind of people. British intelligence in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s operated primarily on the basis of social trust. An Oxbridge degree, a credible reference from the correct college tutor, a proper accent, and a correctly tied tie were, in practice, the primary vetting credentials. The idea that someone who had studied at Trinity and belonged to the right dining societies might also be an NKVD asset was, in the institutional psychology of MI6, categorically unlikely. This was not naivety. It was a structural feature of an organization that had been designed for a world where class membership and loyalty were synonymous. That structural feature was the weapon Moscow chose to exploit. To understand how 5 young men from Cambridge became the most damaging intelligence penetration in Western Cold War history, you need to understand what Cambridge looked like in the autumn of 1933. The Great Depression had entered its 4th year. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had been chancellor for 8 months. In Italy, Mussolini's fascism was entering its 2nd decade. In Britain, unemployment had peaked at 3 million. The League of Nations, the great hope of the post-war liberal order, was visibly failing. For a generation of exceptionally intelligent young men who had been raised to believe that institutions worked and that rationality governed human affairs, the 1930s presented a world that appeared to be systematically disproving every assumption they had been given. Into this atmosphere, the Soviet intelligence service sent Arnold Deutsch. He was 30 years old, Austrian, Jewish, a trained psychologist with a doctorate from the University of Vienna, and an NKVD illegal agent operating under the cover identity of a postgraduate student of psychology. His code name was Otto. He was, by every account that has survived, genuinely compelling company. Curious, warm, intellectually serious, able to hold a conversation about Freud and then about Marxist political economy with equal fluency. He had a particular gift for identifying young men at the precise moment when their disillusionment with capitalism was absolute, and their commitment to an alternative had not yet calcified into anything specific. He found Kim Philby first. Philby had already moved toward communism on his own. He had witnessed poverty in Vienna and made a quiet private commitment to the Soviet cause. Deutsch formalized it, gave it structure, and gave it a mission. Do not wear your politics publicly. Go into journalism, then into government, then into intelligence. Be patient, and one day you will be positioned to deliver information of genuine strategic value to the Soviet state. Philby then brought Deutsch two more names, Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess. Blunt was recruited through the Cambridge Apostles, the ancient exclusive intellectual society at Cambridge, of which both he and Burgess were members, and Blunt subsequently brought in Cairncross. The mechanism was self-propagating. Each recruit identified the next within a closed social world where trust was assumed and discretion was total. Philby later reflected, in one of the most quoted statements from the entire case, "I decided in 1934. Not one day did I regret that decision." He said this near the end of his life in Moscow, and by most accounts, he meant it. If there is a single operation that defines the human cost of what Philby did, not the institutional damage, not the strategic setback, but the cost measured in individual lives, it is Operation Valuable. In 1949, the CIA and MI6 began a joint covert operation to destabilize the regime of Enver Hoxha in Albania. Hoxha had closed Albania to the west more completely than almost any other Eastern Bloc leader. The country was, in intelligence terms, a black box. The operation involved recruiting Albanian émigrés, training them in weapons, communications, and infiltration techniques, and inserting them covertly into Albanian territory to make contact with resistance networks and gather intelligence. The long-term goal was to foment an insurrection that might loosen Soviet influence over the Balkans. Philby was the senior British officer coordinating the operation on the American side, working from the British Embassy in Washington. He attended the planning sessions. He reviewed the insertion schedules. He knew the names of every agent who was going in, the dates they would enter, the locations they would land, and the communication protocols they would use once in country. And before each team departed, he passed every detail to Moscow. The Albanian security services were waiting. Some of the inserted agents were captured on landing. Others made it inland before being seized. A number were killed immediately. The remainder were taken to Tirana, interrogated, and executed. Not one team succeeded. Not one agent returned. The operation was wound down in 1951, having accomplished nothing except the deaths of the men who had been sent in. For years, American and British planners held post-mortems, trying to understand why the operation had failed so completely and consistently. They considered the possibility of penetration. They considered Albanian operational security. The full explanation, that the man writing the analysis of why the Albania operation had failed was the man who had made it fail, was available to them, but they could not make themselves see it. Philby sat in the morning meetings and offered his assessments with the composed, analytical manner that his colleagues had always found so reassuring. He was, by the account of those who worked with him in Washington, very good at his job. The damage accumulated in stages, each one larger than the last. In 1934, Maclean began passing documents from the British Foreign Office. Philby and Burgess were recruited the same year. In 1937, Cairncross was recruited at Cambridge by James Klugman and began passing material from the Treasury. By the time Cairncross moved to Bletchley Park in May 1942, the pipeline had matured into something the Soviet intelligence apparatus had never expected to operate so successfully. Bletchley Park was the most secret installation in the Allied world. It was where British mathematicians and linguists broke the German Enigma and Lorenz ciphers, intelligence known as Ultra, which gave the Allies advanced knowledge of German military movements throughout the war. The existence of Ultra was one of the most tightly held secrets in the history of modern warfare. Cairncross worked in Hut 3, processing decrypts of German Luftwaffe communications. Everything he read, he passed to Moscow. In July 1943, German forces launched Operation Citadel, the largest armored offensive in military history, aimed at the Soviet salient around Kursk. The Soviets were prepared. They had built layered defensive lines of extraordinary depth. The German armored columns, instead of achieving the breakthrough that Wehrmacht planners had calculated, ground themselves apart against prepared defenses. Cairncross later stated, "The information I provided helped the Soviet Union win the Battle of Kursk." Whether that claim is precisely calibrated is debated by historians. What is not debated is that Soviet military intelligence received detailed, ultra-sourced intelligence on German plans before the offensive began, and that a man at Bletchley Park provided it. October 1944. Philby maneuvered his way into the head of Section 9, on instructions from his Soviet handler, as his Wikipedia page now states, with the flatness that history eventually delivers. His first act as head of anti-Soviet operations was to begin systematically informing the Soviets about anti-Soviet operations. During the war years alone, the 5 men passed a combined total of more than 16,800 documents to Moscow, 1,771 from Blunt, 4,605 from Burgess, 4,593 from Maclean, 5,832 from Cairncross, and over 900 confirmed MI6 documents from Philby, alongside oral intelligence that has never been fully quantified. By 1949, the American Venona Project, a long-running effort to decrypt Soviet intelligence cables, had identified a source inside the British Embassy in Washington using the codename Homer. It took 2 more years to narrow the list to Maclean. On the 25th of May, 1951, Maclean and Burgess disappeared from Britain. They surfaced in Moscow in 1955, living in what Soviet authorities described as comfortable circumstances, though their actual first years were spent in the closed city of Kuybyshev, what is now Samara, far from Moscow, under conditions closer to supervised exile than to the revolutionary welcome they had imagined. In 1961, a KGB officer named Anatoly Golitsyn defected to the West and confirmed the existence of what he called the Ring of Five. In January 1963, Philby fled Beirut. In 1964, Blunt confessed. In 1964, Cairncross also confessed. In November 1979, Thatcher stood before the House of Commons and publicly named Blunt. The same day, his knighthood, he had been styled Sir Anthony Blunt since 1956, was stripped. The timeline runs across 30 years and 5 lives, and it does not have a clean ending. Here is what the history of the Cambridge 5 case ultimately reveals, and it is more disturbing than the espionage itself. After the disappearance of Burgess and Maclean in May 1951, virtually everyone inside the combined apparatus of MI5 and MI6 with access to the relevant files understood that Philby was almost certainly a Soviet agent. The circumstantial evidence was architectural. He had been the one man who knew Maclean was being surveilled. He had been the one man positioned to warn Burgess to warn Maclean. And Burgess, who by every account was not supposed to defect alongside Maclean, who panicked and ran, had been Philby's house guest in Washington. The chain of inference was not complicated, but no one could move against him. Not because the evidence was insufficient for prosecution, although it was, but because of what an open accusation of Kim Philby would require his accusers to acknowledge in the same breath. It would require MI6 to admit that Section 9, its entire anti-Soviet counterintelligence division, had been headed by a KGB asset from the day it was operationally significant. It would require an acknowledgement that the Albania operation had been betrayed from the inside, that the deaths of those men were directly attributable to British negligence in vetting. It would require admitting that the special intelligence relationship with the United States, the closest alliance in the Western world, had been built on a foundation that had been structurally compromised. It would require the Foreign Secretary to stand in Parliament and explain how all of this had happened. On the 7th of November, 1955, Foreign Secretary Harold Macmillan instead stood before the House of Commons and stated that there was no evidence that Philby had betrayed the interests of Britain. He cleared Philby publicly and formally. It is, in retrospect, one of the most consequential false statements ever delivered to the British Parliament by a man who subsequently became Prime Minister. The institutional logic was not complicated. The system calculated that the truth was more dangerous than the spy. It gave Philby 12 more years. In those 12 years, he continued to work for MI6 as a journalist asset in Beirut and for Moscow as an active source. The system did not fail to stop him. It chose deliberately not to. Beirut, January 1963. Nicholas Elliott was one of MI6's most senior officers, and he had been Kim Philby's close friend for 20 years. They had drunk together in the same clubs, eaten at the same tables, covered for each other across the blurred professional and personal boundaries that characterized British intelligence of their era. It was Elliott who had defended Philby most vigorously during the 1951 period of suspicion. It was Elliott who had arranged for Philby's return to fieldwork, which was how Philby ended up in Beirut, working as a journalist and part-time intelligence asset through the late 1950s. When the evidence against Philby finally became undeniable, the defector Anatoly Golitsyn had confirmed the Ring of Five's existence, and Cairncross had partially confessed. It was Elliott who was sent to Beirut to confront him. He flew from London and met Philby in his apartment. He told him, quietly and without theatrics, that it was over. By one account, Philby made a partial admission that day. By other accounts, the admission was more extensive than MI6 later chose to document publicly. What is significant is that Philby evidently knew Elliott was coming before Elliott arrived. The implication, one that intelligence historians have never fully resolved, is that a fifth or sixth member of the network, or a separate Soviet source inside MI6, had warned him. The Cambridge Five may not have been five. Eleanor Philby, his third wife, had cooked dinner for that evening. He told her he was going out briefly. She waited. He did not return. That night, Kim Philby boarded the Soviet freighter Dolmatova in Beirut Harbor and sailed east. He arrived in Moscow in late January, where the KGB gave him a pension, a flat, and for the first 7 years, nothing resembling a real role. The organization that had run him for 30 years did not entirely trust him. The possibility that he was a double agent, sent deliberately, festered in Moscow the same way his loyalty had been questioned in London. The most useful spy of the Cold War spent his first years in Moscow in a bureaucratic limbo that mirrored, with dark symmetry, the limbo London had assigned him after 1951. He died in Moscow on the 11th of May, 1988. Soviet decorations on his chest and a postage stamp bearing his face issued by the Soviet Postal Service in 1990. The stamp is still collectible. The Cambridge Five case presents three moral paradoxes that neither law, nor history, nor any of the men involved has adequately resolved. The first concerns ideology and its costs. All five men committed to the Soviet cause during the 1930s, a period when Stalinist purges were killing hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens, when show trials were fabricating confessions from loyal party members, when the Gulag was operating at industrial scale. Philby knew this. Blunt knew this. They continued. The historian Christopher Andrew, co-author of the definitive study of KGB operations in Britain, observed that Blunt displayed a remarkable reluctance to acknowledge the evil he had served, a formulation that captures something essential about the psychological architecture that sustained all five men across their careers. Ideology, in sufficient concentration, functions as a perceptual filter. It makes the evidence of the system's crimes legible only as counter-revolutionary propaganda, until the evidence becomes too large to reframe, and by that point the commitment has lasted long enough that admitting it would require dismantling the self entirely. The second paradox concerns victims. The institutions damaged by the Cambridge Five, MI6, CIA, the British Foreign Office, have never been shy about cataloging their losses. What receives far less systematic attention is the inventory of individual people whose names are not in those institutional postmortems. The Albanians who were trained, equipped, inserted, and then ambushed. The Eastern European agents whose identities flowed through channels that Philby watched. The defectors who were identified through information Philby provided and returned, forcibly, to the Soviet Union. Konstantin Volkov was a KGB officer who attempted to defect to the West in 1945, offering the names of 3 Soviet agents inside British intelligence. He specified one was head of a counter-espionage section in London. Philby personally handled the British response to Volkov's approach, and Volkov was subsequently seized by Soviet agents, flown to Moscow, and executed. The third paradox is judicial. Not one of the 5 was ever tried. Philby defected, Burgess and Maclean defected, Blunt was given immunity in exchange for his confession, continued as surveyor of the Queen's pictures until 1972, and was not even officially reported to the Queen until 1973, 9 years after his confession. Cairncross was also given immunity. The mechanisms of law that exist to address treason were, in every case, subordinated to institutional self-preservation. The system that had been penetrated chose, each time it had the opportunity to seek accountability, to choose secrecy instead. Yuri Modin, the KGB controller who ran all 5 men and wrote about them in his 1994 memoir, My 5 Cambridge Friends, noted with dry detachment that Soviet intelligence itself had doubted the group's product. About half the documents sent back from the Cambridge group were never read, he wrote, because Moscow could not believe that agents of such social standing could have penetrated so deeply. The most damaging spy network in Western Cold War history was partially discounted by the organization it was serving. The institutional consequences of the Cambridge Five did not remain inside the intelligence world. They propagated outward and reshaped the architecture of Western security culture for a generation. The immediate effect on the Anglo-American intelligence relationship was severe. After the disappearance of Burgess and Maclean in 1951, and particularly after Philby's defection in 1963, the CIA imposed significant restrictions on intelligence sharing with British services. The relationship, described in diplomatic language as special, had been built on a foundation of assumed mutual trustworthiness, and the Cambridge case demonstrated that trustworthiness had been commercially sold to Moscow for 30 years. It took years to rebuild the working confidence between Langley and Broadway, and some intelligence historians argue that certain operational scars from that period have never fully healed. The systemic change to British intelligence vetting was permanent. The comfortable world in which the right college, the right tutor's letter, and the right social connections constituted adequate security clearance was replaced. Gradually, awkwardly, with considerable institutional resistance, by formalized background investigation, positive vetting procedures, and the acknowledgement that class membership and loyalty were not, in fact, the same variable. The Cambridge Five made that change inevitable by making the cost of the assumption visible. In literature, the legacy is direct and explicitly acknowledged. John le Carré, who worked for MI5 and subsequently MI6, and who served under Philby before his defection, drew on those years when writing Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy in 1974. The novel's mole, Bill Hayden, is not a portrait of Philby, but a distillation of the type Philby represented. The charming, well-connected officer whose treason is a kind of aristocratic contempt for the institution he has been trusted to serve. The book is the finest fictional treatment of institutional betrayal produced in the 20th century. And it exists because one of its central sources was sitting at a desk in MI6 while le Carré worked in the same building. In 2020, the British government declassified additional files, confirming that a deliberate institutional effort had been made to suppress information about Philby's activities, specifically to minimize political embarrassment. The phrase used in the internal documentation, as reported by historians who reviewed the released material, described the management of the Philby information as a matter of reducing political exposure, rather than resolving a security question. Anthony Blunt's confession, held secret from 1964 until Thatcher revealed it in Parliament on the 15th of November 1979, sat in MI5 files for 15 years, while the man continued to hang paintings in Buckingham Palace. In July 1984, just over a year after Anthony Blunt died, an anonymous donor placed a sealed manuscript at the British Library. It was Blunt's memoir, to be opened 25 years after his death. In 2009, the British Library unsealed it and made it available to scholars. In the memoir, Blunt wrote that he had regrets. He regretted, he wrote, not the espionage itself, not the documents, not the names, not the people in Tirana who died in the dark, but what the espionage had done to his own life. His regret was biographical, not moral. He called the whole affair the biggest mistake of my life, in terms that make clear the mistake he was describing was getting caught, or rather, being exposed. He had expected for 30 years that it would never become public. That was the calculation he had made, and it had been wrong, and he was sorry about that. Burgess died in Moscow in 1963, the year of Philby's arrival, the year the circle completed itself. Maclean died in 1983. Blunt died in 1983. Philby died in 1988. Cairncross died in 1995 in the south of France, the only one to outlive the Soviet Union that had claimed their allegiance, the only one to see the thing they served collapse into bureaucratic rubble without ceremony. As of 2026, more than 20% of the files relating to the Cambridge Five remain classified at the National Archives in Kew. The specific names of agents whose identities Philby provided to Moscow. The full accounting of what Cairncross passed beyond the documents already confirmed. The complete record of what MI6 knew and when it knew it, and what calculations it made about what to suppress. These files remain locked. The number of people who died because of the information the five men passed has never been officially confirmed. It has never been systematically investigated. There is no official accounting, no monument, no acknowledgement directed at the people whose names were on the lists that traveled from London to Moscow across 30 years. The system did not collapse because of its enemies. It was hollowed out by the men it trusted most.